Instead of being under the hood, like most master cylinders in cars these days, the master cylinder is actually underneath the cab. So in the driver's side floorboards, there's an access panel here. Normally there's a bolt right there, but I have removed the bolt because I've been working on this master cylinder for a while now. So we flip open the access panel, and you can see right there is the brake pedal. So when I press on the brake pedal, the brake pedal rotates right here, and it also presses down on the plunger right there, and that goes into the master cylinder, and that's what forces brake fluid through. Now, the cap for the master cylinder is way down in there. Yep, way down in here. Very hard to get to. So this right here is what the master cylinder looks like when it's removed. In here is the plunger. The plunger presses on this thing, and that's what creates the brake pressure, and then the pressurized brake fluid comes out right here. So this is the cap I was talking about on the master cylinder down in the truck, and as you can see, it's square with rounded corners. So a 6-point socket will not work on it. I also tried a 12-point socket, and that did not work either. I was going to try an 8-point socket, but I could not find an 8-point socket that was big enough. This is a 13/16 square impact socket. This is what I use to change the tires. The back tires use this. And as you can see, it fits perfectly. So this fits on the cap, but I can't get it down to where the cap is. I have also tried putting it in from the side here, and that doesn't work either. Now, what I started to try and do is, if you notice the edges of this hole, I started to try and widen this hole so that I could fit this down there. Unfortunately, it didn't work. The metal is just so thick that cutting through it takes forever. Now, I have also tried going at the master cylinder from underneath the truck and using either a wrench or a pair of vice grips or a pair of pliers, and nothing works. I can't get anything to stay on that nut and try and turn it from underneath the truck. After some digging around, I found this thing. So this thing fits down in the hole, and with a little bit of work, okay, so it's on the cap right now, and I can turn it, or try to. Need a little more torque maybe. So as I was saying, I can turn it. Did that work? I think that worked. Okay, there we go. Okay, now if if I can get that thing out of the hole. And then maybe, no, it's not loose enough to go by hand. Well, I got it off, I got it loose, that's the important thing. So, using this tool right here, I was able to stick it down into the little hole, and I was able to put it over the thing like that, other way, and I was able to turn it, thereby being able to take off the cap of that master cylinder. Now, I wasn't able to do it with this short handle here. Unfortunately, I couldn't apply enough torque with this short handle, so I had to use my little handle extender. And then I was able to apply a lot more torque, because of course torque is pound-feet, it's pounds of force applied over however many feet of handle. But the bottom line is I got the cap off the master cylinder, so now we can actually fix the brakes. So we are down here behind the front tire, and I just wanted to show you how to bleed the brakes and how to drain the fluid out of the brake system. So right here is the wheel cylinder. This line right here is where the brake fluid that's pressurized comes into the wheel cylinder, which you can see part of it is right here. Now that is where the brake fluid presses on the thing that actually moves the brake pads. In this case, these are drum brakes, so it moves the shoes outward to press on the drum. And then right here, this thing above it, try and get my finger into a position where you can, yeah, right there. That is how you bleed the brakes, so you get all the air bubbles out through there. So it works just like a nut. You stick the wrench on. This is a 7/16. So you stick the wrench on there, and you turn it right to close it, you turn it left to open it, and that is, when it's open, the brake fluid and any air bubbles come out. So, before we open it up, we'll use this tube here, and this tube is just the right size that it sticks on to the end of that, and the end of the tube can direct the fluid into the bucket. So, we're going to switch to this camera up here. Hopefully that will be able to see everything, because none of the tripods are the right size to be able to see that. Okay, hold it. Okay, so we loosened that bleeder valve, we hooked the hose up so that all the fluid went in the bucket. And if we were just bleeding the brakes, we would pump it a few times and wait until there was a steady stream of brake fluid coming out. That would signify there's no air bubbles. However, since we were bleeding the whole thing, we were draining the whole thing, we pumped the brake pedal with this all attached, with it loose, until all the fluid came out, and then there was nothing but a few drops and a bunch of air coming out. So that means that the entire line up until this point is clear. It has no fluid left. So now we can go around to all of the other wheel cylinders and the two valves on the booster pack, the air, where the air comes into the system. Once we drain all of those, we can refill the brake fluid and we can bleed the brakes, and then hopefully the brakes will be working. So this is the rear axle, and the ones on the rear axle are a lot easier to get to because you don't have the stuff for the steering. And another thing I want to point out, so I have a GMC M211, and one of the differences between the M211 and the M35 is that the M211 has two wheel cylinders on each wheel. So you would have one wheel cylinder and bleeder valve on the top of the wheel, and then another one down on the bottom. But the M35 only has the one on the top. So working on the brakes in this truck is actually going to be a little bit easier than working on the brakes in the other truck, because we have essentially half as many wheel cylinders that we have to drain and then later bleed. So, you've probably made it this far in the video and have been like, wait a minute, what did you actually do to fix the brakes? I mean, I didn't see replace the master cylinder or take apart any of the wheel cylinders or check any of the lines. You never said what was wrong with the brakes. All you did was drain out the old fluid and replace it with new fluid. And you're right, I didn't fix the brakes. I just temporarily made them work. So when I finally got the cap off the master cylinder, there was a little bit of fluid in there, but not much. So that's the problem. The brakes didn't have enough fluid, and that's why I was having trouble stopping. Now, the temporary fix to that would be to add more fluid in, but of course you have to think about why there's so little fluid in the first place, because brake fluid, it doesn't really evaporate. It especially shouldn't get warm enough in the truck while it's parked to evaporate. Brake fluid, it's designed to be able to heat up to really high temperatures before it boils. So it's got to be leaking somewhere. Now, I didn't see any place where it was leaking. There was some residue on the inside of the rims, inside of the front rims of the truck. And so I was thinking that might be brake fluid, but I also noticed a rip in the steering boot, and so it could be the grease from the steering boot. I couldn't tell. I don't think it was brake fluid, because brake fluid eats paint. That's a good thing to know if you ever have any car. Don't spill brake fluid on it. Don't set the container of brake fluid down on it, because it will eat through the paint. But yeah, I didn't see any paint peeling, but I'm not sure. And then of course, after I drained the brake fluid, I got some of the brake fluid spilled onto the rim, and so I couldn't tell what was spilled there by me and what was already there. And so no, I didn't do anything to fix the brakes. I don't know why the fluid left the system. There's got to be a leak somewhere. I'm just hoping that it's a slow enough leak that I can just keep adding fluid, and then eventually down the road I'll deal with it later. But so yes, I did not technically fix the brakes. Now you may be wondering, why didn't you just add more fluid? Why did you drain the old fluid out? Well, two reasons. First of all, it's a good idea. I have no idea when the last time the brake fluid in the truck was changed, and the reason you're supposed to. I know most people I know don't actually change their brake fluid or flush their brakes, flush out the old fluid at all. But you're supposed to change the brake fluid periodically, because the brakes collect moisture, collect water. And then that water, depending on what type of brake fluid. So there are several types of brake fluid, several specific brake fluids for different instances. But the two main ones that I'm going to talk about that are important for this truck is .3 and .5. So the military brake fluid, the brake fluid that was used in the military was I believe it was a silicone based, and it is .5 fluid. .5 fluid is hydrophobic. It actually repels water, and it's lighter than water, so in .5 fluid, all the water that's in the system actually separates from the brake fluid, and it's found at the lowest points in the brake system, right by the wheel cylinders. Now, that's good when you routinely flush your brake system, bleed your brake system, because you can get out all that excess water, and you don't have to change the entire fluid. You don't have to change all the fluid, you just have to top it off at the top while you open up the bleeder valve and let all the water out, and then once the brake fluid starts flowing through, you close it, and you can go for longer periods of time without actually changing the fluid. However, if the brakes, especially if the truck sits for a long time without anybody touching it, and I don't feel like having to worry about draining all of those valves every time, every year or so, every 6 months. So anyway, if that water is able to sit in those lines in the wheel cylinders, it'll actually start causing rust, and that could cause further brake problems. Also, the water could freeze. If the brakes get hot, the water could boil out, and then you've got air or water vapor, water moisture in the brake system, and then the brake system just doesn't work. If you want me to explain how a brake system works, let me know down in the comments below, because I can explain it on the whiteboard, and so that you can understand exactly what's happening and all of the stuff that I'm talking about now. For instance, why is air in the brake system bad? Like, why? So, the military fluid the fluid that was used in the military was a .5 type fluid. The most common brake fluid nowadays is .3. Any car from the 80s on up. I think there's newer brake fluids out now, but anything from the 80s to the mid-2010s is probably going to take .3 brake fluid. .3 brake fluid is
called hydroscopic, and that means that it absorbs moisture, so it takes in moisture from its environment. So if you ever see a thing of .3 brake fluid, it says right there on the container, do not leave this container open, or use single use only, something like that. You're not supposed to store containers of brake fluid that have been opened, because once that seal is broken, it's going to start absorbing moisture from the environment. Now, it does that so that we don't have the problems with the heat, we don't have the problems with the moisture expanding, causing rust, or boiling out, the problems that I discussed with .5 brake fluid. It basically makes it so that those problems don't happen, because all the water gets absorbed into the .3 brake fluid, and that whole mixture, that whole fluid mixture, has a very high boiling point, a very high, very, very low freezing point, and the water is so diluted that it's not going to cause rust. However, with .3 brake fluid, once you start getting a lot of water into that brake fluid, it's no longer going to be effective. The boiling point is going to decrease, which means it's more likely that your brake fluid is going to boil out if your car overheats. And also the freezing point will increase, and that will make it more likely that your brake fluid could freeze in the winter. And also rust. The more water there is, the more chance there is for that chemical reaction that is rust to occur. So that's why if you have .3 brake fluid, you're supposed to change the fluid, get all the fluid out, all the brake fluid out of your car, and put fresh fluid in and bleed the brakes. And you're supposed to do that every 5 years, I think, is what some cars recommend. But basically, you're supposed to do that. It's part of the maintenance intervals if you look in your owner's manual. So, you're supposed to. Not a lot of people do, but you're supposed to. But anyway, so .3 and .5 brake fluid. One of them's hydroscopic, one of them's hydrophobic. And if you know anything about hydrophobic and hydrophilic, hydroscopic is like hydrophilic, but on steroids. That's the easiest way to explain what hydroscopic is. But if you know anything about those two don't mix. So you can't have a mixture of .5 and .3 brake fluid in your brake system. It will cause problems. The fluid, because it won't mix properly, you'll get this separation, and it's just not, it has the possibility to cause problems. So, I don't know which brake fluid is in the truck, or was in the truck. I don't know whether he used a traditional .5 brake fluid like the truck was originally intended for, or whether he switched it out for .3 brake fluid. I don't know. I decided to go with .3 brake fluid, and to be safe, I decided that if I'm adding any .3 brake fluid, I want to get all the old brake fluid out, and just in case it's actually .5 fluid, I want to get all the brake fluid out. For instance, in the GMC actually had .5 brake fluid. And the reason why I know that is because when I opened up the bleeder valve on the wheel cylinder, first came out a ton of water. It was just water coming out. Then eventually brake fluid started coming out. So that's how I knew it was .5 fluid. So I drained all that out and then replaced it with .3 fluid. And I did the same thing with the 1952 REO M-35. So that's the reason why I drained out the old fluid before putting the new fluid in. And yes, I did not actually figure out where the leak is, if there is a leak. I didn't figure out what was going on with that. But at least now that it's got some fresh fluid in, some of those leaks might actually seal up on their own, especially if they are very small, very slow leaks. And also, now that there's fresh DOT3 fluid in, if I ever need to add fluid in the future, I can just add it. Also, I can take off the cap on the master cylinder now, which is what I was struggling with all the way back when I was first changing the spark plugs before I even knew that the head gasket was bad. I was working on the brakes because they weren't working. And so now in the future I can add more DOT3 brake fluid, and eventually, if this problem persists, I can actually start looking for the leak.